In the heart of the Arabian Peninsula lies a nation defined by sand. Endless dunes stretch across the horizon, shimmering under a relentless sun. Saudi Arabia, a kingdom built on oil wealth, faces an existential challenge that money alone cannot solve. Nearly 95% of its territory is desert, and that desert is growing. For decades, the Saudi government watched as their land degraded further, as sandstorms swept across borders, as food security became increasingly fragile. They knew something had to change, but when they tried to fix it themselves, nature pushed back harder than they expected. This is the story of how one of the world's driest nations turned to an unlikely partner, a country that was once consumed by deserts itself, to engineer one of the most ambitious environmental transformations in modern history. This is the story of how China is helping Saudi Arabia turn sand into forest, 1 billion trees at a time. The Desert Kingdom's growing crisis. To understand the scale of Saudi Arabia's challenge, we need to zoom out and look at the numbers. When we talk about desertification, we're not just talking about sand dunes and barren landscapes. We're talking about land that's dying, soil that can no longer sustain life, ecosystems collapsing, and communities losing their ability to grow food or access clean water. Saudi Arabia ranks among the most severely affected nations on Earth when it comes to land degradation. Only Western Sahara, where approximately 97% of the territory consists of desert, faces a more dire situation. But Saudi Arabia isn't far behind. With desert covering roughly 95% of its landmass, the kingdom is essentially one vast expanse of arid terrain punctuated by scattered pockets of habitable land. What makes this particularly significant is Saudi Arabia's geographic footprint in the Middle East. The kingdom occupies approximately 70% of the Arabian Peninsula's total land area. This means that when powerful winds sweep across Saudi territory, and they frequently do, the effects ripple far beyond national borders. Dust storms originating in Saudi deserts carry sand and particulates into neighboring countries like Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, creating regional environmental pressure that affects millions of people. The economic toll is staggering. According to research and government assessments, Saudi Arabia loses roughly $13 billion annually due to desertification-related impacts. These losses manifest in multiple ways. Media, farmers walking through barren fields, empty greenhouses in Saudi Arabia, animated graphs showing economic losses due to desertification, reduced agricultural productivity, damage to infrastructure from sandstorms, increased healthcare costs from respiratory illnesses caused by dust, and the enormous expense of importing food that cannot be grown domestically. Food security has become a particularly acute concern. In a nation where arable land is scarce and water resources are severely limited, the ability to feed a growing population of over 35 million people depends heavily on imports. More than 80% of Saudi Arabia's food comes from abroad, a vulnerability that became painfully apparent during global supply chain disruptions in recent years. An ambitious vision takes root. Recognizing that the status quo was unsustainable, Saudi Arabia's leadership decided to take bold action. In 2021, as part of the kingdom's broader Vision 2030 modernization agenda, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced the Saudi Green Initiative, an environmental program so ambitious in scope that many international observers initially viewed it with skepticism. The numbers were eye-catching: $50 billion in investment, 10 billion trees to be planted over the coming decades, 40 million hectares of degraded land to be restored, and a commitment to transform 30% of Saudi territory into protected nature reserves. The first phase alone was monumental. The goal was to plant 450 million trees across the country and expand protected areas to cover more than 10% of total land area. On paper, it looked transformative. In practice, it would prove far more difficult than anyone anticipated. when reality meets the desert. In 2022, as work crews began implementing the Saudi Green Initiative, they encountered obstacles that no amount of money could immediately overcome. The desert environment proved far more hostile to large-scale afforestation efforts than planners had anticipated. Consider the conditions these young trees faced. Summer temperatures in Saudi Arabia's interior regularly soar to 43 degrees Celsius. That's nearly 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is bone dry, with humidity sometimes dropping into single digits. Rainfall is sporadic and minimal, averaging less than 100 millimeters per year in most regions. The soil, after centuries of wind erosion and minimal organic matter accumulation, lacks the nutrients and structure needed to support root systems. Every seedling planted required constant irrigation, gallons upon gallons of water delivered consistently over weeks and months. But Saudi Arabia is one of the most water-scarce nations on the planet. The kingdom already depends heavily on energy-intensive desalination plants to meet basic human needs. Diverting massive quantities of fresh water to keep millions of saplings alive simply wasn't feasible at the scale envisioned. Then there were the sandstorms. During spring and summer months, powerful winds sweep across the peninsula with remarkable force. These storms don't just deposit fresh layers of sand, they physically uproot vegetation, tear branches from established shrubs, and bury anything in their path under meters of shifting dunes. Planting crews would return to sites they'd worked on weeks earlier, only to find their efforts completely erased, either torn from the ground or suffocated beneath new sand accumulation. The survival rate of planted seedlings was devastatingly low. Within days of planting, many young trees would wither despite irrigation efforts, unable to cope with extreme heat and poor soil conditions. Those that initially survived often succumbed to subsequent stresses, drought periods between waterings, unexpected temperature spikes, or damage from wind and blowing sand. Faced with these harsh realities, Saudi officials made a difficult decision. In 2022, they announced a pause in the Green Initiative's implementation. Investment was suspended. Planting operations scaled back dramatically. The ambitious timeline suddenly seemed impossible. For nearly 2 years, the initiative remained largely dormant as officials grappled with fundamental questions. How do you make trees survive in one of Earth's most inhospitable environments? Where do you get enough water? What species can actually endure these conditions? And how do you prevent sandstorms from destroying everything you build? Then, in 2024, something unexpected happened. Saudi Arabia announced that the 10 billion tree plan was being revived, but this time, they wouldn't be going it alone. In June 2024, Saudi Arabia hosted the global celebration of World Environment Day, and the theme was directly relevant to their struggles, desertification, land degradation, and drought resilience. During this event, Saudi officials made a significant announcement. They were seeking international partnership, specifically with China, to tackle their environmental crisis. Why China? The answer lies in a remarkable environmental success story that, honestly, most of the world had overlooked. Decades ago, China faced its own desertification catastrophe. At its worst point, nearly 2.6 million square kilometers of Chinese territory, an area larger than Mexico, had degraded into desert. The Gobi Desert was advancing southward at an alarming rate. Sandstorms from northern China would sweep across the country, sometimes reaching as far as Beijing, where residents would wake to find their cars and streets covered in yellow dust. Agricultural land disappeared beneath expanding dunes. Rivers dried up. Communities that had farmed the same land for generations were forced to relocate. But China didn't accept this fate. Starting in the 1950s and intensifying in subsequent decades, the Chinese government launched what would become one of history's largest and longest-running environmental restoration projects. They called it the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, a massive tree planting campaign aimed at creating a great green wall across northern China to halt desert expansion. The project was unlike anything attempted before. It wasn't just about planting trees randomly. It required developing entirely new techniques for desert agriculture, engineering solutions to capture and conserve water, breeding plant species that could survive extreme aridity, and coordinating efforts across millions of hectares over multiple decades. The results, well, they speak for themselves. Over 70 years of sustained effort, China has successfully treated more than 20 million hectares of desertified land. Forest coverage in the country increased from roughly 12% to nearly 14%, a seemingly small percentage change that actually represents millions of hectares of new forest. More importantly, China achieved what many considered impossible. They reversed the tide, stopping desert expansion and, in many areas, actually pushing it back. The transformation became known as green advancing, sand retreating. When Saudi officials learned about China's achievements, they saw a potential solution to their own crisis. Here was a nation that had faced similar challenges: extreme aridity, poor soil, limited water, hostile climate, and had developed practical solutions that actually worked at scale. The partnership that emerged was substantial. Saudi Arabia and Chinese companies signed a strategic cooperation agreement worth $50 billion, matching the original budget for the Saudi Green Initiative. But this time, the investment would be backed by proven expertise and technology. Chinese companies committed to providing comprehensive support: desert control technology, drought-resistant plant species, irrigation infrastructure design, soil improvement techniques, and ongoing technical assistance. Most remarkably, Chinese partners expressed confidence that they could help Saudi Arabia achieve its goal of planting 10 billion trees by 2040, a timeline that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The scope extended beyond simple tree planting. Under the agreement, Saudi Arabia aimed to transform 30% of its desertified land into functional green spaces and increase renewable energy's share of national electricity generation to 50%. This wasn't just environmental restoration, it was economic transformation. Chinese experts wasted no time. Within weeks of the agreement, teams of ecological engineers, hydrologists, and agricultural specialists arrived in Saudi Arabia to conduct comprehensive assessments. They surveyed terrain, analyzed soil composition, studied local weather patterns, and identified optimal locations for initial projects. The first priority was solving the water problem. Without reliable irrigation, nothing else would matter. Chinese engineers designed and helped construct a 225-meter-long dam standing 10 meters high, a structure purpose-built to capture and store the kingdom's most precious resource. But even with a dam, where would enough water come from to sustain billions of trees? The solution lay in the Red Sea. Along Saudi Arabia's western coastline, Chinese contractors assisted in developing large-scale seawater desalination infrastructure. One facility alone was designed to produce 400,000 cubic meters of fresh water daily, roughly 100 million gallons. This fresh water would be transported via pipeline to storage facilities, including the newly constructed dam, ensuring a steady supply for irrigation operations deep in the interior. But getting water to the dam was only half the battle. The real challenge was distributing it across vast expanses of desert to wherever trees were planted. Chinese planners proposed an extensive pipeline network stretching 1,350 kilometers, nearly 840 miles, that would carry water from coastal desalination plants deep into the kingdom's arid heartland. This infrastructure would ensure that even trees planted far from any natural water source could receive consistent irrigation. With water infrastructure under development, attention turned to the plants themselves. Not just any tree could survive in Saudi conditions. Chinese agricultural scientists shared varieties they had spent decades developing, species bred specifically for extreme drought tolerance, heat resistance, and ability to thrive in nutrient-poor soil. These included various acacias, hardy shrubs, and specially adapted species that required minimal water once established. Equally important was soil improvement technology. Desert sand lacks the organic matter and microbial life that healthy soil contains. Chinese experts introduced techniques for amending soil composition, adding nutrients and organic materials that would give young roots something to grip and draw sustenance from. The true test came at Thadake National Park, located north of the Saudi capital, Riyadh. This 600 square kilometer expanse had long been typical desert, arid, barren, and honestly, seemingly lifeless. Saudi officials selected it as the pilot site for the new approach. Using Chinese methods and technology, work crews began the transformation. They planted 250,000 trees and 1 million shrubs across the landscape. But they didn't just dig holes and drop in seedlings. Following Chinese guidance, they constructed terraced dams throughout the park. Small barriers designed to capture any rainfall that occurred and prevent it from quickly running off or evaporating. Every drop of water that fell would be retained, giving plants the maximum opportunity to absorb moisture. The irrigation system was carefully calibrated. Water from the pipeline network fed into distribution points throughout the park, ensuring consistent moisture delivery during the critical establishment phase when young plants are most vulnerable. Then came the waiting. Would these plants survive, or would they wither like so many previous attempts? Within months, the answer became clear. The trees and shrubs weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Green began spreading across the formerly brown landscape. Valleys that had been dust bowls started showing vegetation. The stark desert scenery gradually gave way to something unprecedented, actual groves of living trees, their roots digging deep into improved soil, their leaves capturing sunlight and releasing oxygen. By late 2024, Thadake National Park had been transformed. Where there had been only sand and rock, now stood genuine green corridors with valleys filled with vegetation. The transformation was so dramatic that it became a showcase site, proof that the seemingly impossible could be achieved. Emboldened by the success at Thadake, Chinese partners developed plans to dramatically accelerate the pace of afforestation. Starting in 2025, they proposed introducing cutting-edge technologies that would industrialize the tree planting process while improving survival rates. Among the innovations were intelligent robotic tree planting systems capable of preparing soil, placing seedlings at optimal depths, and applying initial watering, all with minimal human labor and maximum precision. Modern nursery facilities would be established to cultivate millions of seedlings under controlled conditions before transplanting them into the desert. Germplasm resource technology would ensure genetic diversity and optimal species selection for different microclimates across the kingdom. Perhaps most impressive was the proposal to implement satellite remote sensing combined with advanced data analytics. Sensors in orbit would monitor every hectare of planted area, tracking soil moisture levels, vegetation health, growth rates, and early signs of stress. This information would feed into AI-powered management platforms that could predict problems before they became visible and optimize resource allocation across thousands of square kilometers. Even emerging technologies like blockchain would play a role, creating transparent carbon sequestration tracking systems that could certify Saudi Arabia's environmental gains to international standards and potentially generate carbon credits. Another innovation involved combining solar energy with sand control through photovoltaic panel installations in desert areas. The panels would provide shade that reduces soil temperature and evaporation while generating renewable electricity. A dual-purpose approach that addresses both environmental and energy goals simultaneously. The success at Thadake and the promise of new technologies gave Saudi Arabia renewed confidence. In December 2024, the kingdom hosted the 16th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, a major international gathering focused on land degradation issues. During the conference, Saudi representatives shared their progress and outlined even more ambitious plans. They announced intentions to attract over $100 billion in investment over the next decade to expand ecological restoration efforts. And they explicitly credited Chinese technology and partnerships as essential to this progress. We have established long-term objectives for environmental restoration and management, Saudi officials stated. Chinese technology and enterprises are playing an indispensable role in helping us achieve these goals. But Saudi Arabia didn't want to stop at its own borders. Building on the momentum from the Saudi Green Initiative, the kingdom proposed an even grander vision, the Middle East Green Initiative. Under this expanded program, Saudi Arabia would partner with other Arab nations to plant an additional 40 billion trees across the broader region. The potential impact is staggering. Scientists calculate that a single mature tree absorbs approximately 22 kilograms of carbon dioxide annually. If Saudi Arabia successfully plants 10 billion trees, those trees would sequester roughly 220 million metric tons of CO2 each year once mature. The additional 40 billion trees proposed under the Middle East Green Initiative would capture another 880 million metric tons annually. Combined, 50 billion trees would represent about 5% of the global afforestation target needed to meaningfully address climate change. These forests would restore approximately 200 million hectares of degraded land, an area roughly the size of Mexico, bringing vegetation and ecological function back to terrain that had been barren for generations. Saudi Arabia's urgency in pursuing these initiatives becomes clearer when examining the broader environmental crisis facing West Asia and North Africa. This vast region, stretching from Morocco to Iran, confronts some of the most severe land degradation challenges on Earth. Approximately 75% of arable land in the region has already suffered significant degradation, reducing its productivity and ability to support agriculture. Water scarcity affects roughly 60% of the population, hundreds of millions of people who lack reliable access to clean drinking water or sufficient supplies for farming. And projections suggest these numbers will worsen substantially by 2050 as population growth, climate change, and continued land degradation converge. Desertification in this region isn't an abstract environmental issue. It's a direct threat to human survival and political stability. When land can't support crops, food prices rise. When water becomes scarce, communities face impossible choices. When rural areas become uninhabitable, people migrate to overcrowded cities or across borders, creating social tensions. Some researchers have linked environmental degradation in Syria to rural hardship that contributed to the social unrest preceding that country's civil war. Recognizing these stakes, Saudi Arabia used the UN conference to call for broader international cooperation. They urged more nations to ratify and actively implement the UN Convention to combat desertification, and proposed an ambitious collective target reducing land degradation by 50% globally by 2040. Saudi Arabia's decision to partner with China rather than pursue solutions with Western partners or go it alone was strategic and based on demonstrated results. China's journey from desertification victim to global leader in desert restoration spans 7 decades and offers lessons directly applicable to Saudi conditions. In the 1950s, when China first confronted its expanding deserts, the country lacked modern technology, funding, or international expertise to draw upon. What they had was determination and the willingness to learn through trial and error over the long term. Early efforts often failed. Planted trees died, sand barriers collapsed. Water management systems proved inadequate. But with each failure came refinement. Chinese researchers developed grid-based sand control techniques, creating checkerboard patterns of straw or brush barriers that stabilized dunes and reduced wind erosion. They experimented with thousands of plant species to identify which could survive with minimal water. They learned to plant in patterns that mimicked natural vegetation distribution rather than uniform rows. They discovered that certain shrubs could survive on less than 200 millimeters of annual rainfall if planted correctly. Over decades, these techniques evolved into comprehensive restoration systems. Modern Chinese desert control incorporates photovoltaic installations that provide shade for plants while generating energy. Agricultural sand control methods create productive farmland in previously barren areas by gradually building soil quality. Aquaculture sand control techniques introduce fish farming in desert regions, creating microclimates that support broader ecological restoration. The cumulative results are documented extensively. China has successfully treated over 20 million hectares of desertified land, that's 200,000 square kilometers, or an area larger than Cambodia. Approximately 53% of the country's controllable desertified land has been brought under effective management. Net desertification has decreased by roughly 65 million AMU, about 4.3 million hectares. Through the 3 North Shelter Forest Program alone, China has protected 538 million mu and actively restored 118 million mu of degraded land. Forest coverage increased from 12.41% to 13.84% of total land area, representing tens of millions of hectares of new forest established over recent decades. And critically, 61% of land suffering from soil erosion has been brought under control, preventing further degradation. These aren't theoretical achievements or plans for the future. They're documented transformations visible from space. Satellite imagery shows the greening of northern China, with brown desert regions replaced by green vegetation across vast territories. Former desert areas now support agriculture. Rivers that had dried up have been restored. Communities that evacuated due to advancing sand have returned to land that can once again sustain them.